Welcome to the first in a series of videos about AP Human Geography. So this is Unit 1, Geography, its nature and perspective, and in this video I'm going to go over a lot of the key terms that we need to know. So let's get started. The first one is geographic perspective. So the geographic perspective is a way of looking at and understanding the world through a geographic lens. So you can look through this in many ways, such as location or diversity, or if you look in this picture right here, there's so many different ways to look through a geographer's standpoint. Next up, we have spatial perspective. Spatial perspective is observing variations in geographic phenomena across space. So for example, in a political election, you can sort of see how everything is spatially distributed. And to do this, you can use maps, compasses, and globes. Next, we got the cartogram, and it is basically a map on which statistical information is shown in diagrammatic form. So, and this is a cartogram of the United States with all the states smushed to different sizes to represent something. So next, we have cultural ecology. Cultural ecology is basically the multiple interactions and relationships between a culture and the natural environment. So for example, the Hawaiian people and their climate, they're often perceived as happy because Hawaiian people, they live in sort of a happy climate. So therefore, the ecology of the region really affects their culture and stuff. Also, as in this example, this lady is really connected to her field, which is also her environment, the ecology in which she lives in. After is cultural landscape. The cultural landscape is basically the visible imprint of human activity and the culture on the landscape. So it's all the layers of buildings, forms, and artifacts. And oftentimes it's sequentially imprinted on the landscape by the activities of various human occupants. So for example, the Great Wall is a cultural landscape of China because of all the layers that have been built onto it by different dynasties. Next is diffusion. There are many types of diffusion. Two of them we'll talk about here are expansion and relocation. Expansion is basically when the phenomena originates in one area and remains strong there and then spreads outward. So it always has that central hub, or the Hearth, as we'll learn later. So for example, from sweet to iced tea is an example of expansion diffusion. Also, relocation diffusion is a phenomena which is carried by migrants to a distant location and diffuses from there. So for example, pizza in the US, it was brought over by the Italians and it was made a big thing over here. So that would be relocation diffusion. So direction. There is also two types here. There's absolute and relative. So absolute direction is like the exact spot on Earth where something is. So north, south, east, west, where it is. Relative direction is the relationship to another object. So up, down, left, right. So like Mexico City is southwest of New York. So that would be in relative direction. After that, we have distance. So this is much like direction. There's also absolute and relative. So distance that can be measured with a standard unit of length, so like miles or kilometers, that's absolute distance, seen right here. And then relative distance is a measure of the social, cultural, and economic relatedness or connectivity between two places. So like an airplane reducing travel times, that's all relative. You can't really define it by an absolute distance. Next, we'll go over distance decay. So distance decay is basically the effects of distance on interaction. So generally, the greater the distance, the less interaction, obviously. So migrants not moving as far as planned is an example of migrants not going because as the distance gets farther, there's less interaction with their home culture, so they might not want to leave as much. Also, So here's a graph of distance decay. So when the distance is small, there's a lot of interaction, but if you get farther, there's less interaction. After we have distortion. So distortion is a misrepresentation of shape, area, distance, or direction of or between geographic features when compared to their true measurements on the curved surface of the Earth. So for example, if you look at a map, many times certain places are distorted. So like Antarctica isn't really that big on the bottom, and Greenland is also way bigger than it should be. Next up, we have distribution. Distribution is basically the arrangement of features in space. So like there are three main properties of it: the density, the concentration, and the pattern of it. So right here, everything looks to be in the south area. This is a kudzu distribution, which is an invasive species from Japan. So also you can see this in like religious regions, how like different areas of the United States will have different types of religions concentrated or distributed around there. After that is environmental determinism, and environmental determinism is basically the view that the natural environment has controlling influence over various aspects of human life, including cultural development. So for example, Greece was like this great place for thinking. So many people think the environment influenced Aristotle and all the thinking he had in the Mediterranean area. Next up is Possibilism. So this is sort of like the opposite of environmental determinism, and this is basically a geographic viewpoint response. And it says that human decision making, not the environment, is really the controlling factor in human development. So humans aren't really controlled by their environment, they're really controlled by what they choose to do themselves. So rising sea levels is not because of the environment, it's because of human issues. Next up is formal and uniform regions. So basically this is a type of region marked by a certain degree of homogeneity. So something is really similar. So all these counties in Georgia are really similar. They're linked together to Georgia in the south. And basically in this area, it's called uniform because it's homogeneous. There are many things that are similar. So in these areas of Georgia, something similar is probably the climate. So the climate is pretty much the same throughout Georgia. After is friction of distance. This is sort of like what we looked at earlier with the distance decay, but this is basically saying that an increase in time and cost usually will result as increasing distance. So if you go farther away, you'll also have less interactions, but the increases in time and cost will occur because you're going farther and it takes more to go a farther distance, obviously. So this is usually used in like economics and exports. So the farther you go, the more time and cost it will take. After that are functional and nodal regions. This is basically a region defined by the particular set of activities or interactions that occur within it. So this is like a central city, and then it's talking about its suburbs. This is really just the functional and nodal regions of an area. And also like Washington, D.C. is our capital, and the surrounding functional nodal area would be like the suburbs of it. Next, we have geospatial data, so like the census and satellite. So the census and satellite are types of geospatial data, and the census is a periodic official count of a country's population, sort of to see if the population is rising or decreasing. The satellite is definitely also a tool that's used, and it's basically used to sort of scan the Earth's surface. And usually people rely on this because a small country or state politically or economically will depend on one another. So if you know this kind of data, it can really sort of just solve the diplomacy issues if any of those arrive. Geographic Information System, or GIS, is also sort of like a geospatial data, and it's basically a collection of the computer hardware and software that permits spatial data to be collected, recorded, stored, retrieved, manipulated, analyzed, and displayed to the user. So basically, you see all these different parts of data. So you have the street level, building level, vegetation level, and when you combine them, you can get the Geographic Information System, or the GIS. So usually the internet is used to do this, and on Google Earth, you can usually see this in real life. Also important is the Global Positioning System, GPS. So often you see this like Google Maps, your car. And basically it's a satellite-based system, and it determines the absolute location of places or geographic features. So it tells you like the coordinates, and it tells you the precise location on Earth. So you can really just navigate where you need to go. Next is globalization. Globalization is basically this expansion of economic, political, and cultural processes, and it's expanded to the point that they all become like global. They become one in scale and impact, and basically the processes transcend the state boundaries. So maybe countries still exist, but all this global trade and interaction doesn't exist because everybody is so connected now. And because of this, the boundaries sort of just like disappear, and the outcomes across the places and scales really just become similar because everything is becoming more global. And you see this with domestic and international brands, like Coca-Cola has basically gone to every corner of the earth now. That's globalization. Next up, we have the Hearth, and the Hearth is really really connected to diffusion, actually. Remember that central hub I talked about earlier? The central hub is called the Hearth. So a Hearth can be for anything, and it's basically the area where an idea or cultural trait originates. So right here is a map of the major hearths of agriculture, where different types of agriculture first developed. Also, you see things like cultural traits, so like fashion is usually associated with like Milan or Paris or New York City. These are really the hearths of all the sorts of fashion. Independent invention is basically a term for a trait with many cultural hearths that developed independent of each other. So like agriculture was independent invention because you see different crops sort of develop individually from each other. It's not like there was one central place and everything just diffused from there. So basically inventions that develop independent from each other. After I think we already talked a little bit about location, absolute, and relative. In recap, it's basically absolute is when the position or place of a certain item on the surface of the Earth is expressed in degrees, minutes, seconds, latitude, longitude, so the exact coordinates is absolute location. And relative is like the regional position or situation of a place relative to other places. So the distance, the accessibility, the connectivity. So like North America is northeast of Australia. That would be relative. Next up, we got perceptual and vernacular regions, and this is basically a region that only exists as a conceptualization or an idea, so it's not really official or demarcated actually. So like the South is a perceptual region, so is the Mid-Atlantic. There's no like actual physical thing that says this is Mid-Atlantic.